One of Putin's greatest legacies will be as one of the greatest unifying forces for Ukrainian nationhood in the 21st century. As different as we are from east to west and from north to south, we've really come together in the face of a full-scale invasion. And regardless of regional differences, Ukrainians are stronger and more united now than they've ever been before.
Welcome to the St. Martin's Cloak Podcast, where we go behind the headlines to focus on humans, not statistics. In today's episode, we're speaking with Kaitlyn Kruk, a ground crew and board member of the NGO Ukrainian Patriot, and Denis Polishchuk, a member of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. We hear from Kaitlyn and Dennis about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, Ukrainian dance and culture, conditions in Ukraine this past winter, the human story behind those headlines, how aid on the ground actually works, why smaller, agile groups like Ukrainian Patriot are uniquely effective on the ground, and much more. But first, a quick introduction. Hello, everyone. This is Andrew Loftusness recording from Istanbul.
And Milos Majore here, recording from London.
Milos, we're coming right off the back of our first episode on Ukraine, the first of many. This one has been a long time coming. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, this is one that I think both of us have really been wanting to get on as a subject. And actually, you yourself have some experience directly with Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, Ukraine was the first humanitarian cause that I became involved in a serious way. I have made two trips there. First one was in April of 2022. That's so shortly after the beginning of the full-scale invasion. And then, long story short, I returned for a second trip, also of about 3 months, starting in the late winter, early spring of 2024. So, yeah, this is a cause that is extremely important to both of us. I met Kaitlyn actually in Ukraine. That was the connection, and that's how we were able to set up this interview. I have a tremendous amount of respect for Kaitlyn and for the entire team at Ukrainian Patriot. I've met a number of their volunteers and their staff who were there at the same time that I was. So I was very grateful that we were able to set this up with Kaitlyn, and that Kaitlyn was able to put us in touch with Dennis as well.
Yeah, absolutely. No, they were both incredible in terms of the amount of knowledge and experience that they were willing to impart onto us and onto the listeners as well. I definitely hope that everyone listening gets something out of it, because I mean, this is one of those topics that, as you mentioned, we're doing an episode on it now, but it's definitely going to be the first of many. And it's because unfortunately, just Ukraine is too big of a subject to condense into one episode, and it's also been going on for quite some time now. I mean, the start of the full-scale invasion was February 2022. That's, at this point, more than 4 years ago. So we're in its fifth year of the war, which is, it's just mental to think about. I mean, do you remember the start of the war? Like, how was it for you? On my end, it was, I was in Europe, in Luxembourg specifically, and just remember waking up with that news that for so long it seemed like, a bluff or just another sort of one of those geopolitical games happening kind of far away. But then you wake up early morning and there it is. And there was just this sense of dread hanging on everyone that I met, like, people on the street. And quite soon thereafter, it seemed like there was not only protests on a wide scale, but also efforts made to help in whatever way they can and send as many things as possible to help people in Ukraine, people fleeing Ukraine. But over time, I think it's kind of, unfortunately dissipated. I mean, you certainly don't see as many of these pro-Ukrainian protests, and there's definitely a dynamic to explore. But was it similar for you?
Yeah, it was a very similar feeling in the United States. I was living and working in Washington DC at the time, and it's one of these things where the world can and often does change overnight. This is like in Ukraine, talking to like normal Ukrainian people, and more than one person like expressed to me, I never thought what happened in Syria could happen here, right? And of course, with that example, it's Russia both times. But as you were saying, there was this incredible rush of both sympathy and outrage all around the world. And then that it's shocking to say if you are actually aware of what is going on in Ukraine, but it didn't last that long in the grand scheme of things, right? And we get into this a little bit with Kaitlyn and Dennis in the interview, but when in my first trip to Ukraine, it was in that early period, and what it seemed like was that like everyone in the world was like, okay, how can we help?
Yeah.
Right. And then by the second trip, that was not the case. Right. And things are much worse. This is simply the reality because of the direction that the United States is in right now and its current trajectory.
I think, just to add to what you were saying, I think there was this effect with Ukraine, and we talk about this with Dennis and Kaitlyn, of the line between purely humanitarian help and help that goes to the military is somewhat more blurred than in other humanitarian zones, right? And the reason, quite simply, is that the country itself is in an existential situation in which essentially all, especially young men, but also women, have been drafted up to protect the country from the invading Russian force. And you can donate all the traditionally humanitarian supplies as you want. You can send in the money, but if there isn't a secure way of delivering it, or if there isn't a secure way of receiving it, that simply just isn't going to go anywhere. So you, in a sense, have to start by ensuring that that security is viable and ensuring that the Ukrainians can determine their own future for themselves.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I would like to say it goes without saying, but here we are. The only just outcome of the war in Ukraine is a Ukrainian victory and a Russian defeat, right? And at the same time, that is one of these rare circumstances where if you look at this from the perspective of the United States and many other countries as well, but just to use the most prominent one right now in terms of countries that should be supporting Ukraine to a much greater extent and not that long ago were at least much closer to doing the right thing, right? We're doing more of the right thing than we are right now. This is one of those very rare examples of hard national security interests, the defeat of Russia aligning with what is, uh, I'll say, unquestionably morally just, right? Which is the defense of Ukraine, and for many reasons that we probably won't dive into because that's not what we focus on here. That is no longer the consensus in the United States. I think that is both a tragic and mind-boggling fact, right? But here we are, and to your point, nothing can get better until the war is brought to an end, and the war needs to be brought to an end with a victorious Ukraine and a defeated Russia. Now, unfortunately, policy decisions outside of Kyiv, in particular in Washington, D.C., do have, as we know, real world impact, right? I thought it was very interesting when Kaitlyn was talking about how directly because of the war in Iran, it's now more expensive to drive ambulances to the front. And what might have been possible in 2022, 3, 4, 5 might not be now, right? If nothing else, as a matter of political will from the United States. But regardless, the humanitarian situation itself will become incalculably worse, as Dennis mentions in the interview, if Russia is not defeated in Ukraine. Bottom line, that's a fact.
Yeah, exactly. And that used to seemingly be a joint understanding of a lot of Ukraine's supporters from the point of view of states. But I mean, we're recording this on April 15th, and there was a there was a headline this morning that JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, was essentially saying that cutting off aid to Ukraine was one of the achievements in the negotiations that the US was leading. So, I mean, clearly there has been, as you mentioned, a shift uh, in that support. And it is having really real impacts on the everyday lives of people in Ukraine. And again, at a risk of repeating myself, we're going to be talking about this a lot. There's all sorts of angles regarding Ukraine we can take. We decided to kick off the Ukrainian series, as it were, with examining events from recent months, in particular this past winter, which was one of the harshest winters that Ukraine has gone through in the past 2 decades, which is hard to work with in the best of times. Now, add on to that the fact that Russia is systematically attacking centers, or rather, should I say, energy infrastructure across the country, which is, well documented across multiple organizations. And it just has that gruesome effect of, affecting people way behind the battle lines in the east.
And in territory that Russia cannot conquer, we know what they do. They bomb it daily, every day across Ukraine. And territory that they at least temporarily occupy, we also know what they do, right? Look at Bucha, for example. That happened very, very early on in the war. And I visited Bucha in 2022, and just to put things in perspective, this would be like if an invading army attacked Old Town Alexandria outside of Washington, D.C., and literally murdered, raped, and tortured the population that far from the nation's capital, right? These are facts. This is what happened. It's happened all across Ukraine. That's what Russia does in the territory it is actually able to get its hands on, and in the territory that it cannot, it bombs.
For our non-DC listeners, pick any capital city's major suburb, and that would be a rough sort of representation of what Andrew was alluding to here. So, yeah, I mean, you make the point. It's just there was no halting it, and we will be examining Bucha and other similar accounts in future episodes, no doubt. And as you mentioned, it's the fact that it's really a targeting of Ukraine's ability to continue moral fortitude, which is holding. And I'm not going to say the R word. I am going to say it, the resilience word, which, as Dennis points out, Ukrainians are somewhat fed up of hearing. And that is a common trope throughout many humanitarian zones that, yeah, it's great to be seen as resilient, but you don't want to have to be in that position in the first place, right?
Yeah, 100%. It's striking talking to both Kaitlyn and Dennis and speaking with, or just hearing from a number of Ukrainians over the years, and you hear people say things like that, and then we go to Lebanon and we talk to Iman, and there's commonalities in all these places in the world where the civilian population is having an unjust war inflicted upon them, right? at the same time, there's commonalities between the people who help in those situations. Um, and that's been interesting to see and kind of realize. And we wanted to, as Milos said, the war in Ukraine is such a massive topic, and there are so many injustices occurring every single day that it can be difficult to, with the types of things that we cover on this podcast, to know where to start. We'll get into some of the actual numbers in a little bit, as well as during the interview. But this last winter in Ukraine was the most harsh, not only in terms of the winter itself, the temperature, but the Russian attacks against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, intended, of course, to murder Ukrainians and also to break their morale, their spirit to resist, which of course failed.
Yeah, and just to highlight this even further, I mean, this past winter, you had sustained temperatures well below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 17 degrees Celsius. Russia was conducting attacks, as you said, on a daily basis across multiple regions of Ukraine, specifically almost 17 whole regions of Ukraine in January alone, right? Now, considering the fact that Ukraine is made up of 27 total administrative regions, this represents essentially 2/3 of the country being affected, right? And if we want to take a quick comparison here, that would be the equivalent of almost 32 out of the 50 US states having their power cut off amid a coldest winter that you can imagine in the United States. In the UK, that would represent almost 8 regions, including the whole of Scotland, the Greater London area, the Southwest and Southeast, East and West Midlands, and Yorkshire, affecting nearly 42 million people. Coupled with the fact that in many parts of Ukraine, cities still rely on the emblematic Soviet apartment blocks that don't rely on single-use heating or single apartment heating, but rather they've got this common centralized heating that makes it a very easy target for Russian strikes, aiming to cause as much suffering related to the cold as possible. And as a result, you get people not only directly suffering, but also people wanting to leave, internally displaced people, adding to the strain of the infrastructure abroad. And by the end of January, there was the mayor of Kyiv, Vitaly Klitschko, who stated that as much as 600,000 people had fled the city in search of relatives or friends in the countryside, with the hopes of using any other form of heating, including firewood, coal, oil, to offer some respite to the freezing conditions. But that's quite enough of me blabbing on. I think we should get on to the actual interview itself, which, as you said, we conducted remotely with 2 people, one of whom, Dennis, I have to say this, was sporting the most fantastic mustache I've ever seen on a man. And I don't say this just to be funny, but he knows it. I told it to him. Fantastic. But beyond that, they are both fantastic people. Both, and back to one of our points we made earlier, both young people who are involved in this and, taking time out of their lives to help others, right? And to ensure that Ukraine is able to live on and fight back against this oppressive imperial power trying to devour the whole country, right? So we thank them not only for their time on our podcast, but also for all the work that they're doing.
And as noted, this is the first of many interviews about Ukraine yet to come. We have a lot of friends inside Ukraine that we plan to speak to. But for now, ladies and gentlemen, we bring you Kaitlyn Kruk and Denis Polishchuk. Dennis, we really appreciate your time tonight. So the news covers a lot of high-level diplomatic summits and Trump tweets when it comes to the war in Ukraine right now. But I think a trend, especially in the United States, is that coverage tends to overlook the human element. So, for example, especially in American media, we hear a lot about questions of exchanges of territory and negotiations, but something I think we almost never hear about are the actual people who live on that territory. So what's something that you think that an average American, Canadian, or European outside of Ukraine should understand about the humanitarian situation at this point inside of Ukraine?
Well, good evening, Andrew, and thank you very much for having me. I think one of the biggest misconceptions, perhaps, or misunderstandings, is that everything is very homogenous. Ukraine is the largest country entirely within Europe. And somebody with, I've often heard, unfortunately, certain theses about, well, why doesn't Ukraine just give up the Russian part of Ukraine and be done with it? And it's far more complex than that. For historical reasons, yes, there's a portion of the country that is Russian speaking, but it's not compactly situated and located in one certain spot. And even within the eastern regions and the southern regions where you do have more Russian speakers, there's a very large percentage of ethnic and Ukrainian speakers as well. And those are the people that, as we've seen under Russian occupation, face the gravest crimes being committed against them. And also going back to the point of Ukraine being a very large country, I often very whimsically hear, especially new reporters that come to Ukraine for the first time and they come to Lviv or Kiev and they say, well, it doesn't even feel like there's a war going on at all. Well, again, it's it's a very large country and each region experiences it very differently. Um, so yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind that uh, there's a lot going on many different levels, and you can't, if you want to truly understand the situation, you can't just oversimplify it like that.
Definitely. So this is perhaps a broad question. So whatever comes to mind for you when you hear this, but what do you think is not being adequately covered right now by international media? Again, when it comes to uh, the identity of the Ukrainian people themselves, or again, just the overall humanitarian situation and the impact of the war inside Ukraine right now.
I think unfortunately there's a little bit of Ukraine fatigue, you could say. And yes, people are more keen to follow the headlines regarding negotiations and tweets and possible solutions, territory exchanges. Um, what's not being covered is the human element, which we saw a lot more of when it was a very uh, um, exposed very in a very raw fashion at the beginning of the war when the first territories were being liberated from Russian occupation. Uh, Unfortunately, since then, the front lines have become far more static, and one can only imagine what the situation is like in the occupied territories. That's something that's not talked about. And again, when it comes to negotiations and peace deals and then land swaps has been thrown around. I don't know what we're swapping for. Um, but again, you have to take into account the people on the ground who are living there and what that means for their lives and what that means for their well being. Um, and also, finally, just in a larger context, um, Ukraine often now, again, with the Ukraine fatigue that some people are calling it, it's not a charity case. Yes, we do require assistance. There's unfortunately a lot of humanitarian assistance that needs to happen. But Ukraine has the largest, most capable, battle-proven military on the European continent right now, I would say, apart perhaps from Russia, but you know. Um, Given the difference in numbers and the difference in results, I think that can be argued. Uh, but this is something that's going to be, unfortunately, in my opinion, very needed for the entire West. Um, Moving forward in a world where, unfortunately, the rules based order seems to be crumbling. And, if you want peace, prepare for war. And I think that's something that's often overlooked. Ukraine's potential and value to its Western partners, not only as a bulwark, but also really as a partner. And also, it's important to keep in mind that often Ukraine is compartmentalized. And, as soon as something more exciting and pressing happens, such as in Israel or Gaza or Iran, Ukraine gets pushed to the sideline. But as we've seen in an ever more interconnected world, this all has knock-over effects. And so what's happening in Ukraine is going to affect not only the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, it's going to cause policy changes elsewhere. It's going to cause other events elsewhere. And that's why I think it's important to not only support Ukraine for the sake of supporting Ukraine, but also for world peace, if you will.
Absolutely. And I think that, there's many different examples that we could give, but I think Ukraine is demonstrating that right now on a global level in the Middle East as a result of the fallout from the war in Iran.
So I just wanted
Absolutely.
to round out on something you touched on once or twice already, which was this idea of countering the narrative of Ukrainian homogeneity amongst the people. Could you just briefly elaborate a bit more on what you think of when I say the Ukrainian people, and what is it that the international media could get wrong regarding its coverage of Ukrainian people at large?
It's a good question. Ukraine is, for the most part, ethnically and in terms of identity, Ukrainian. There are several different languages that are spoken. And again, that's not compactly and nicely, secluded to one area where you can make a clean cut. So in that sense, actually, Ukraine is very homogenous in the sense that it's quite different from region to region where you go, but there's still kind of a sense of Ukrainian identity regardless. In terms of what the international media might underrepresent, I've heard one, despite all these differences and despite all of these regional variants, I forget who this was said by, but I think I quite like this quote that one of Putin's greatest legacies will be as one of the greatest unifying forces for Ukrainian nationhood in the 21st century. As different as we are from east to west and from north to south, we've really come together in the face of a full-scale invasion. Regardless of regional differences, Ukrainians are stronger and more united now than they've ever been before.
Yeah, brilliant. I wanted to bring the conversation now to this past winter. And obviously, Ukraine is such a huge topic that we'll likely be revisiting it in future episodes. There's just too much to talk about for one episode. But focusing on this past winter, and I don't need to give you guys the facts, you know undoubtedly more than me, but some estimates are that Russia launched more than 10,000 missiles and drones specifically just on energy infrastructure, right? And of course, Russia bombs civilian infrastructure in Ukraine on a daily basis and targets energy infrastructure every winter. But something about this last winter seemed different from the past. Was that something that you felt? And in your experience, what do you think Russia was trying to achieve through this past year?
Well, this past winter definitely has been quite unique in many different aspects, including what's I think estimated to be a threefold increase in attacks. But it's also been one of the harshest winters in recent memory. In Kiev, we were getting temperatures of minus 25 some nights. And at a certain point, it was easy to predict when the next large strike would occur simply by looking at the weather app and seeing when the coldest temperatures would be, because that's when the Russians would be trying to strike. There was definitely a sense that they were trying to demoralize the population. I mean, it was an incredibly difficult winter logistically, just in terms of, basic amenities, but also it needs to be said that, never underestimate the enemy, and don't think that their goals are as simple as that. I definitely think that part of that was also aimed at disrupting Ukraine's industry, in particular defense industry. As of late 2025, Ukraine has been producing or supplying up to 75% of its defense needs in-house, locally. And that's something that the Russians have been unable thus far to disrupt effectively. And I think they saw the opportunity this winter for kind of kill two birds with one stone, demoralize the population, and go for the defense sector. Thankfully, it seems they failed at both. Spring has sprung, and we're all still here. I mean, yes, it was a difficult couple of months, but we all knew that winter was going to end, and that we just had to hold out, one day longer than their strikes and their attempts to squash us. And I think that's what we've done very successfully.
So, to continue on that note, international headlines, both this past winter, but really since the start of the full scale invasion, typically sound something like Russian strikes hit energy infrastructure in Odessa, and then the story quickly moves on. What we want to ask you is, what is the actual human story behind those very brief headlines? What are people outside of Ukraine or who might not have personal family connections to Ukraine not realizing?
So I think, first of all, when you hear a headline like that, you imagine, infrastructure being destroyed. That's that. No, unfortunately, there are workers there 24/7 when it's critical infrastructure. There are first responders, and Russians, being a terrorist state as they are, they often employ what one would call a double tap method, where they hit critical infrastructure, they cause human casualties, and they hold off for half an hour, 45 minutes, until first responders get there, and then they hit the first responders again in that same location. Now, that's just the immediate strike. The knock-on effects, I mean, it varies. I think the workers of our Ukraine's critical infrastructure have, against all odds, did their absolute inhumanely best this winter. But that being said, there was times where, for example, myself, I live currently in the center of Kyiv. Due to one of these attacks, pipes froze over, and from the beginning of the harshest winter conditions until spring, my apartment had no heat. Um, Now, thankfully, I had electricity, and I got a little space heater for my bedroom, and that's just a very, anecdotal. Um, and I count myself very lucky. When there's no lights, I light a candle. But again, that kind of doesn't speak justice to it all, because, for instance, one of my brothers in arms, he has his wife who lives here in Kyiv, and they have a 4-year-old and a newborn, and she lives on the 13th floor of a high rise. Now, imagine being stuck with two kids on the 13th floor of a high rise, no electricity, so the only way up or down is stairs, no hot water, no heating, and here you get an air raid alert. And what are you supposed to do? Um, you know, I have one of my neighbors. She has an elderly mother who lives on the other side of Kyiv, who's also, I think, on the 15th floor, who's bedridden and can't fend for herself. And so my neighbor has to constantly go over there and make the several runs up and down the stairs, and she's not a young woman herself. And, these are little anecdotes, but it just goes to speak to how every facet of life is affected and is made so much more difficult. And you yes, we've been tired of hearing how resilient we are. Yes, Ukrainians are very resilient, but we would really like to not have to be that way.
What has the international aid response been like, both this winter as opposed to in the past, but more generally in Ukraine, again, just at this point in the war?
So I think, again, this winter we had a unique set of circumstances where we've had weather conditions that we have had not had for the last 4 years, and unfortunately, due to a decrease in international support from Western partners, um, in particular the United States of America, the humanitarian response has been the Europeans and other Western allies have had to increase the amount that they're able to provide, but they've also had to narrow the scope of the aid that they can provide. So, you know, if you have to choose between emergency power generation or water supplies, you're going to go for the emergency power generation. And so we've seen things that kind of fell by the wayside because there's only a limited amount of resources that one can allocate, and so you have to really prioritize in that situation. I think from what I understand, roughly only 50% of humanitarian funding was met by the end of 2025 for Ukraine for this winter. And so it made things all that more difficult.
I think on top of all of these, literal uh, material issues that you get, whether it be, the actual stopping of aid and such, on the international front, I think we've seen just a massive amount of disinformation out there when it comes to reporting and describing what's happening in Ukraine. And that could be two-fronted, right? It could be both purposeful, as in, actual Russian disinformation campaigns, which we know they're very good at, but perhaps just as damaging and perhaps even wider in scope is just this phenomenon of very uninformed influencers with huge platforms and political influence spreading that misinformation. You are in Ukraine, but you've also got that experience abroad. Are there any sources that you recommend for English speakers who want to make sure they're getting accurate information about Ukraine?
Certainly, that's a very good point. And yes, there's both the Russian subversion, as they used to call it in the Soviet times, and there's also the useful idiots, as they used to literally call them in the West. And unfortunately, I'm pressed to see which is worse. Um, in terms of certain resources, I mean, yes, there's. I often tend to look out and seek out professional analysts, people with who've done research in the area, people who. I mean, yes, we all have our political biases, but analysts who try and present the information and provide a realistic analysis without political biases. Um, on top of that, I would also encourage people to, uh, you know, engage in a little bit of a media hygiene and media literacy. If something sounds sensationalist, it probably is. If you hear something, try and find a second and a third source for it, preferably from somewhere that's perhaps not your comfort zone when it comes to the news resources that you usually rely upon. I think I've seen this definitely in Canadian and American, and to a lesser extent, but also in British media. There's a very heavy politicization on how the facts get reported about in Ukraine. And so I would encourage everyone to kind of step out of their political comfort zone and see what the bigger picture is. One good, I guess, resource or app I think it is for this is Ground News. I'm not, this isn't a commercial, but I know that they often provide and they show which stories are skewed to which political bias. And in terms of analysts, you off the top of my, I mean, this is more of a long form kind of format, but if you have the time and if you're interested in the subject, two would recommend are Jonathan Fink. He runs a couple of different podcasts, some longer form, some shorter form. It's called Silicon Wafers or Silicon Bites or Silicon Curtain. And then there's also Dr. Jason G. Smart, who reports for the Cave Independent, and he has his own little blurb on YouTube. And sometimes I must admit that you know supporters of Ukraine, when reporting on Ukraine, are a little bit overly optimistic. And that's also something that, if you wanted to stay informed and you want to get a real feel for what's really the situation on the ground, um, take everything with a grain of salt, be skeptical, be realistic, and, just think for yourself.
Think that will be very helpful for listeners, and we will definitely link all of that out in the description of this episode. So, in a few minutes, we're going to speak with Kaitlyn about her work at Ukrainian Patriot and ways that people can support those efforts. And one of the reasons we wanted to talk to someone from Ukrainian Patriot is because since the start of the full scale invasion, there's been this ecosystem, I think we can say, of international aid groups with grassroots connections in Ukraine. And I'll just add, I think that these groups that were purposely, especially formed after the start of the invasion, are the most effective on the ground by far. So, as a Ukrainian, what role do you think that these smaller and more agile groups play when it comes to providing aid and support of Ukraine?
I completely agree with you, Andrew. Uh, from my own experience, especially doing a little bit of humanitarian and volunteer work at the beginning of the war before I came over to Ukraine and joined up, international organizations and structures, I mean, they're I find them very overregulated, um, somewhat wasteful in allocation of resources, including for running of an internal bureaucracy, and they're rigid in their responses, and they're very reactive. Um, Now, to go back to your initial question, what is the advantage of these smaller grassroots movements? It's that they're not as rigid. They're on the ground. They have an ear to the ground. They have a personal connection with the individuals that are directly affected. They can be much more proactive and be much more rapid in their responses in a ever shifting environment. Um, and it's they have a lower overhead. They have a better connection to the situation on the ground, and whenever possible, I think if somebody wants to support Ukraine, especially the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, it should be organizations such as Ukrainian Patriot that they should be seeking out and supporting in whichever way they can.
Well, you kind of stole my last question there, which was going to be that, just wanted to preempt, first of all, by thanking you for your time today, but also just reminding, the point of this show that we do, these episodes. Our goal with every episode is to provide listeners with concrete ways they can actually help. And as I said, I was going to ask you what are some of the most effective ways that people abroad can support the people in Ukraine. And of course, you mentioned Ukrainian Patriot. And are there any other resources or avenues that you would recommend at this point?
I mean, there's a plethora of small organizations, not small, yes, smaller localized organizations that are working both here on the ground in Ukraine and with their branches abroad, whether it be Canada, the U.S., or elsewhere. Those are definitely in need of support. However, at the end of the day, the humanitarian support, which is greatly required, only goes to mitigate the results of the problem and cannot address the cause of the problem, which is Russian aggression. So, for anyone who's truly wanting to support Ukraine, yes, definitely, the humanitarian aspect is very important. But if Ukraine gets defeated on the battlefield, it's going to be insurmountably larger and far more complex and far more difficult to help the people on the ground, and the needs are going to be far greater. Um, so if you want to support Ukraine, you also have to support her defenders. Otherwise, you'll have nothing left to support. And I know for a lot of organizations, this can be very challenging, especially given legislative hurdles in many Western countries where small NGOs can't get involved in that. So, in addition to supporting these NGOs, which are doing great work on the ground, I would also petition your listeners to reach out to their representatives in government and let them know that this is an issue which is near and dear to them and that needs government support for Ukraine, for Ukrainians to be able to defend themselves and finally get to a point where they will not require humanitarian assistance.
I really appreciate that. I think that was all very insightful information that I think is going to provide a lot of key insight for listeners.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, he's all right. He's all right. Just kidding. Dennis and I have known each other many, many, many moons now.
How long has it been?
It's like, well, I just turned 30, almost 15 years. We used to Ukrainian dance together in Canada, and we're all enmeshed in Ukrainian community here and now in Ukraine and doing very different things, but all for the same cause.
Actually, could you describe Ukrainian dance to listeners who aren't aware of what that looks like?
Ukrainian dance. Ukrainian dance, as Dennis already mentioned, in Ukraine being so vastly different from region to region, is what makes Ukraine and Ukrainian dance very interesting and very cool, is that the steps, the folk, the ethnography behind each village, each region varies from corner to corner of the country. This stemming from their rituals or symbolism around maybe weddings or events and creating kind of dance step movements. And Ukraine, with an unfortunate some thanks to the Soviet Union, has been able to put this onto stage, onto a larger platform, and has really showcased the different regions of Ukraine in a very technical and athletic way. So go and Google Ukrainian dance or YouTube it, and I'm certain that you'll be impressed by at least some of the basics.
Yeah, not your average wake up stretch routine, I'm sure.
No, definitely not. Yeah, we've taken it. I mean, really, I joke about this all the time when I'm teaching and adjudicating and things that, okay, relax. It's folk dance. It comes from the village, but we've brought it to such a caliber, both in Ukraine and Ukrainian diaspora around the world, to dance competitions, to real festivals, and like, oh, did you get a gold medal for this? And it's very much like the ballet kind of other side of dance world, but it's folk dance, and so it's an interesting evolution of it.
Kaitlyn, what was your connection to Ukraine before February 24th, 2022? And what was your journey in getting involved with support for Ukraine after that day?
So I'm a born and raised Canadian, but come from Ukrainian descent, diaspora. And so I grew up, as I joke, in the garlic curtain of Canada, being that it's many Ukrainian towns with a lot of this influence. I grew up going to Ukrainian church, Ukrainian bilingual school, immersed in Ukrainian dance and songs, and really the culture was the way that I grew up. So that's been my connection always. I've traveled back and forth to Ukraine. I had the opportunity to study dance and ethnography there in 2017 and 2018, and had big plans to return at the end of 2019, 2020, with the pandemic shifting life choices a little bit. And then in 2022, when the full-scale invasion started, it was an immediate and obvious response that I was going to get involved in some way or another to be of assistance. I still remember the first trip that I ever took to Ukraine. I was a teenager, and we landed in Kyiv, and we spent the afternoon walking around, and it felt like home. It felt like where my soul belonged, my heart, and it felt this deep connection to my ancestors. And so when the full-scale invasion started, everything changed for me. This felt like a necessary step to protect a place that I came from through the grapevine in the distance, but that was very near and dear to me. And in general, being a young person, thinking and looking at what was going on, that this can't happen anymore. This is why we have, this world connection and politics, and we're supposed to protect each other from these sorts of things. I don't want to read about it in more history books, and be the hands and heartbeat to make a little bit of a change.
Definitely. And we will ask about the startup of Ukrainian Patriot in a minute, but how did you become involved with UP specifically? Like once, as you said, you essentially immediately decided you're going to do something to help. How did you become involved with UP in the early days?
Yeah, so Ukrainian Patriot was founded officially by February 27th, 2022. And I have a number of connections still in Ukraine. I was glued to my phone, keeping in touch, seeing what was going on, reading the news. And within that first few days, of course, feeling so helpless. And Lana Nyland, who is the founder of Ukrainian Patriot, who's based in Kiev, began within that first 24 hours, began running live videos. And so I would look forward to her live Facebook about what was going on, a real truthful update to keep people informed. And I think it was by the second video that I watched, I had messaged her and was like, what can I do? What can I send you? What can we do? And at that point, she had let me know that a few people were already starting to come together in Zoom meetings and text messages and anything and everything that we could do to create Ukrainian Patriot. And so it was kind of an organic start. I've known Lana for a number of years, and so it just felt like this was the call to do something, to get a part of something. And 4 years later, we've really built our airplane while flying it at the same time.
An absolutely impressive feat, no doubt. And actually, could you expand on that a little bit? So you started right after the full-scale invasion started, and now the war is entering its 5th year. How have the aid efforts of Ukrainian Patriot developed over these past years?
Yeah, so like I said, was in full swing by the beginning of March 2022. We'd given it a name, and a number of people across Ukraine and the US and Canada coming together and starting to really just figure out what the greatest need was. And of course, having the connections directly in Ukraine, Lana being the founder, some previous military knowledge, and the situation just actually in the capital at the very beginning. What was needed? What could we do? A few people from the organization or that had come together had previous experience with supporting the Eastern Front from 2014. So they already had a slight bit of insight. But we also recognized that this was very much likely for the long haul. So very quickly, we decided on 5 pillars of operation that we still practice off of today. And this has given us a direction and a form, both for the greatest need in those first few years, and then as we step into the 5th year of how we can solidify and ground the organization to be long-term in support, in assistance of Ukrainian people, Ukraine's defenders, and the land, et cetera, et cetera. So the pillars being protective support for military defenders, keeping them safe. What can we do to protect them? This is not including anything lethal. So not lethal aid, items like IFACs and plate carriers and bulletproof actual plates and helmets. Into medical, so all frontline community-based, frontline hospitals, stabilization points, ambulances. And then the general humanitarian, which is an ever-changing crisis to not crisis to greatest need to a million different things week to week. This also includes all heartbeats, so animals are a fond love of those at Ukrainian Patriot as well. And then 4 and 5, which have really started to take off in this last couple of years, is PTSD trauma assistance and rehabilitation, as well as rebuilding. And these are kind of the long-term focuses in projects and supporting Ukraine well after victory.
Fantastic. I wanted to ask you, over the years then, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you and your team have faced? And, this could be challenges not only in delivering aid on all these pillars that you've mentioned, but also some of the challenges you faced, bringing it back to our conversation with Dennis on keeping and gaining that international attention.
Yeah, as a smaller, like I said, I don't think any of us 4 years ago had any humanitarian or nonprofit NGO charity experience. And so I think one of our greatest strengths in some ways has been that we are learning as we are going. And we're very humble at that. Sometimes I honestly think a little too humble because when we stand up and look at us, we're so showy, give us all the money. It does work for some organizations, and we've never been that way. We've always been able to quietly fundraise and get support in a respectful and very synergetic kind of way with people that align with our mission. There's been, yes, many challenges at that with the aid kind of, as Dennis had mentioned, the Ukraine fatigue. We've gone through a few waves of this fatigue where things have lessened and then got brought back into the news and into more support. So it's kind of like waves that it ripples in and out. For us, ensuring that we have security in keeping going, which is where the projects and that kind of investment starts to come into play. Um, the challenges in terms of delivering aid and just really being in Ukraine in general, even in Kyiv, most especially, as Dennis mentioned and was discussed earlier, of this winter, is that despite all of the challenges, we still have a job to do. No power or not, we're going to the cold warehouse and we need to pack items because there are other people that are in challenges or circumstances actually worse than ours, even in Kyiv. And so, uh, or, getting up the following day, there still being an attack through the city, for example. But again, knowing that we need to leave at 6 a.m. to get to the Eastern Front to deliver to the people that are waiting for us, that are counting on us. Even if he's flying over the bridge and exploding behind you as you're driving out of the city. Like, these are real experiences that some of us have had. And so the day-to-day challenges make day-to-day challenging and in turn then have effect on how our aid is working. One of the things that's the largest challenge at this moment, to be honest, is the war in Iran. This has skyrocketed prices across the world, really, but most especially having an effect in Ukraine. And with diesel and fuel quite literally nearly doubling over the last month, this changes our budgeting. This changes how we can move, how we can fill our cars and get to the places we need to do. And it's not so easy as just adding a few more zeros or asking for more and more funds when we've already got set budgets and trying to follow to keep ourselves sustainable and making the greatest impact to those that need it the most.
So I want to read the UP mission statement for our listeners, and I'm quoting here. It says, "Our strength isn't just in logistics. It's in the human connections we build. We deliver more than supplies. We bring light, love, hope, and connection to those who need it most." So, Kaitlyn, when you think of the human connection that you've built with Ukrainians, who do you think about and what are their stories?
I mean, circling to what Dennis was talking about earlier in the conversation, being that so much of what the media misses is this humanity, the stories, the many, many thousands, millions of stories of each individual, of their challenges, their experience through this full-scale invasion, and at varying region to region. Our mission statement, yes, we want to be the greatest, most personable Amazon ever existed. At the beginning, often we were a little bit made fun of for our light, love, hope, and connection, this bit of this granola phrasing. But it was very important to our founder, Lana, and a number of us on the team that we worked for the long term, and that building this connection right from that first piece of aid handed over is going to be that key to the long-term goal, the rebuilding, the PTSD trauma assistance. We can't just drop food bags every which way, take photos, make ourselves look so lovely, and then never see those people again. Not when our fourth and fifth pillars and our mission is for the long term. Well, then it's for those long term. Right now, they need food bags. Right now, they need hygiene. But in another year, maybe their house needs to be rebuilt. Maybe they need some psychological assistance. Maybe, et cetera, et cetera. So this kind of all ties in together. And in terms of the faces, I mean, there's just thousands. And of course, thousands that I've delivered to and had connection with. But in some of the communities that we've frequented since their liberation and or are just very near to frontline, zero-line communities, these people become like your family. Less and less, maybe in some of these areas, they need your support, but you always check in on them. I don't have any grandparents that are still currently alive, but I have about 8 or 10 babusias across the frontline communities that have adopted me, that look forward to the Katrusia from Kyiv big hug. And so this is that deep connection that even when now some of them, like I said, are not needing aid themselves, it's created this community that in turn they're then helping those still in their community that need, or further. For example, in Izium, one of the things that we often do there is there are a number of people with disabilities or pensioners and things that still need certain supports, but those in that community that are keeping their heads above water as best as they can, come together with Ukrainian Patriot, put together food packages or hygiene packages in the town, and then deliver to those in their own community that are in need. So it's also creating this hope and this connection through their community, actually, when UP is also away from the city or the location.
Absolutely. So, on that note, UP also engages in what you guys call resilience sessions with the communities that you're supporting. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so a lot of us, or a number of us women that come from, there's a few gentlemen, I should say, as well, from Ukrainian Patriot, come from dance and movement background. Along with our little bit granola phrase of light, love, hope, and connection, a lot of us are holistic thinking, and that mind and body connection is very important. And when you are frequenting these kinds of areas, it takes an incredible toll on you, not to mention living in these areas full time or having lived under occupation. So in the communities that we serve, this is where it deepens the connection that we will deliver aid and set up a resilience session with perhaps women or any civilian adults that are in the area, as well as children. And this looks like sitting around and learning some English and drinking coffee and swapping stories. And it's most especially because we have a team of internationals that come in and out as well as locals. So this is interesting for people to be able to tell their stories and have that ripple effect through the world. This can look like art therapy with children, asking them to draw things like their superhero or, what makes them happy. And again, pulling out some of this emotion, allowing them to be children again. And of course, movement. So dance movement, moving their bodies. And again, having a little bit of respite from the current situation. Though many of the times we're still in that location, you can really transform the energy of a room with a few good volunteers and the right attitudes that are there to run this kind of guided resilience in this respite kind of time. And something that we are looking to expand, we've done it a few times as well, is these kinds of sessions with the military. We frequently deliver to them, and I know it's difficult for them to take a little bit of extra time for us. But the few times that we have been able to do a little bit of trench yoga or base yoga and make these guys laugh and make fun of each other and be silly and kind of stupid, this 30 minutes can really keep them going for much longer, which is really lovely to see.
100%. So let's talk about how aid actually works on the ground, because I think a lot of people without connections to these efforts and these communities don't actually have any insight into what happens when they're in the States or in Canada and they click donate, whether it be money or supplies. So on the UP website, you provide a detailed 4-step plan on how the organization functions, which includes carefully reviewing, vetting, and then verifying aid requests to ensure the greatest impact. And I think that something that doesn't get enough attention in the news is this idea of doing due diligence regarding the end user, right? The people who are actually receiving the aid that you guys are providing. So could you walk us through how that process works specifically with UP?
Yeah, I think this is also, of course, one of the things that makes us a little bit special, humbly saying, is that there is no middleman. So we have a large team of, over 100 people all around the world, but those that are actually on the ground are that same team that are doing a lot of the communications and having this hand-to-hand impact. We are 3 separate entities in Ukraine, the United States, and Canada. And so funds come in from different sources, of course. If we're talking about just funds rather than in-kind donations, real supplies being sent over, and the logistic train of this really varies package to package or location to location. But when funds are most specifically funds are coming in, they are reviewed to our requests. So we have a request system through a number of our points of contact. At this point, being nearly 5 years in, 4.5 years, we have established excellent connections through a number of groups of military, a number of medics, hospitals, and civilian locations. And so at this moment, we, for the most part, work through this group of humans because they've been vetted, because we're clear on the exchange of the aid and have all of our I's and T's crossed. The system in which this works, because obviously there are new connections all the time as well, is that, yes, who are they? Can they provide documentation requests so that it's official from one entity, being Ukrainian Patriot, to the person receiving, making sure that it's not going to be resold or passed off to somebody that doesn't need it, or, getting this, again, this middleman interpretation, which is a big reason why we are the ones that load the cars, that purchase the groceries, that make the deliveries hand to hand to ensure this transparency of the organization. And in regard to greatest need, this is always changing. When it comes to defender requests, in my opinion, these are always the greatest need, because usually when somebody is asking, most especially military, they needed it yesterday. And so it's this does take our top priority in our specific budgeting and how we organize funds, but keeping it across still our pillars of operation so that there's equal love to every aspect that we want to help in.
Absolutely. And just to provide greater insight to listeners, what are some of the most common and the most urgent defender requests that you guys get, and the most consistent as well?
Yeah, the most consistent is always going to be medical, in terms of both hospitals, stabilization points, and of course, connection with the military. Medical items like IFAKs, an individual first aid kit. There's never going to be enough of these. These are items that are one-time use. These are items that, a gentleman could be sitting in his blindage and get hit and blasted 100 feet away, and he loses his IFAK. Well, he's not running over to save it before he's getting his butt out of there. And so these are the constant realities and the challenges that come with items like this. Same thing with power banks, power sources, Starlinks, the connection, communication, kind of the basic necessities for a defender and for those to, protect their life and continue the work that they're doing. So across defender support, I would say those are the largest things. And of course, the more lethal items that we do not provide, but then pass them off to those who can assist in that manner as well. In terms of civilian and humanitarian, this has changed week to week and year to year, and a lot of the same situations have come up again in liberated territories. The basic necessities like food, clean water, hygiene, these kind of items are really needed. But then we go through waves where if there's a large-scale attack on a civilian building, well, then those civilians also need this kind of support. And then most especially through this last year was heat and power sources. Like Dennis had mentioned, he didn't have heat for months. In my apartment in Kyiv, I also did not have heat. I was on the wrong power grid and went for sometimes days without power. So having power sources, having heat sources, both for myself and all of the people that we need to support and keep the day-to-day as normal as possible.
I wanted to ask you, and this could be a question for both of you actually. I'm assuming that you've worked with volunteers from abroad as well, people who have come over from Ukraine, or is that a false assumption?
No, yes, many
Oh,
internationals. It just it depends which ones we want to talk about.
oh, I'm sensing some spicy gossip there. But I wanted to ask you, and feel free to go in as much depth as you want on all of this, but what are some of the challenges that you think they have faced in coming to Ukraine as internationals, if any? But I think it's so interesting to discuss that kind of dynamic when you come from abroad and want to help out, and maybe you don't fully know about the country that you're helping, and you want to integrate in a humanitarian organization. How has that dynamic been like? And feel free to be as spicy as you want here, by the way.
As our volunteer coordinator in Ukrainian Patriot, I'm the main liaison, being that I went over there quite quickly and then was coming back and forth from Canada to Ukraine and now living in Ukraine full time. I have a different perspective after every trip, but then also when internationals show interest in coming over. And it is like a job interview. Ukrainian Patriot doesn't, or for example, our organization doesn't go seeking so many volunteers. We believe that people kind of find us in the right manners and for the right reasons. And yeah, dealing with a number of internationals, I think we've accepted volunteers from over 12 countries over the last 4 years, which is fantastic. It's incredible. But it does definitely shine a light on, just the differences country to country, state to state, province to province, and reminding ourselves that if you stepped foot across that border, that you're hopefully all there for the same reason, and that is to support Ukraine in whatever the greatest need is, or in whatever manner you've chosen, or path you've chosen to support within Ukraine. And this comes with all different personalities and all different opinions. And sometimes it's challenging to remember that you are all there for the same reason, and to not let ego and these things step in, which unfortunately I think it's not unique to Ukraine, that anybody in the humanitarian sector knows somebody else in the humanitarian sector that does walk around and act like a hero. And then you have those that are very humble and uncomfortable by this word hero or, fantastic human being, because we're just doing what we think is right and we're just kind of keeping on. And so it's a personality dynamic as well. I think volunteers coming to Ukraine International, some are overly educated and some are undereducated. You run into those who think they know everything because they have Facebook and have watched everything on YouTube. And to kind of put a pin in what their expectations are versus what they're actually experiencing can be a bit challenging. And then those who come and are so adorably, blissfully ignorant. And I'm not sure which one is worse or more challenging. They both just come with their challenges, I suppose. My greatest advice to anybody coming over is that coming over to Ukraine, I think, is usually a selfish and selfless choice. You need to accept that selfishly you want to be a part of something bigger than you, and help. And then the selfless, of course, wanting to help. But I think prior to coming to Ukraine, it's important to decide where that line is for you and what you're really looking to do. We have a number of people that come through or reach out, and they just really want to be where the action is, man. They just really want to be in the most affected communities. And for me, this is like red flag slapped me in the face because, 4 years ago, I wore ballet slippers, not a bulletproof vest. And I'll tell you, 4 years later, wearing a bulletproof vest and driving under drone netting is not so much fun. And I don't do it because it's fun or because it looks cool. I do it because I know the people on the other side of that line who need our support. And so there's a bit of this that plays into it, I think, as well. But generally, if you're coming because you just want to help and you're open to any which way that is, you can be useful, and it's great.
On the volunteer side of the house, have you guys experienced any sort of drop off or fatigue in the willingness and the number of people who approach you guys seeking to volunteer since the start of the full scale invasion?
Yeah, absolutely. I think at the beginning, the first year, I stayed home in Canada for the very first year. Even though I was a grown up, my parents were not pleased about the idea. So my first trip was in 2023, where there were, of course, still a number of internationals and still are today. But I think from what I understand, that first year was a little bit cowboy and chaos, which worked because it was chaos and the greatest need, whatever needed to happen, happened. And everyone closed that year and said, okay, what we did, haha, it's in the past, it's the history now. As the war has wagered on, a lot of good people have come and gone, as we discussed earlier, and was mentioned that there is so many things going on around the world. So if they're somebody that's a more general humanitarianer, they've moved on to the next, not more important thing, but different thing, different challenge in the world. And then those who have the personal connect to Ukraine have stuck around and come and gone. So it's come in waves. It's faltered here and there. Of course, through the winter, nobody wants to come because it's not ideal unless you come from already a cold place and don't mind. This winter, by October, November, we understood that it was going to be very challenging. And so we did advise to some of our incoming volunteers if they wanted to adjust their plans. It was totally reasonable and that it was going to still be a very busy winter, but be a much more challenging one. And so having that option was okay. And then, as I mentioned, we haven't had to look for so many volunteers. People often find us, and we can manage the workload, both with a small amount of internationals and now our more solidified ground crew. That includes myself, having lived there now full time, a couple of local Ukrainians, a couple of other internationals that are also grounded and living full time in Ukraine. So it's a flowing operation always. And I think 4 years later now, definitely question those who are coming over now for the first time, and what their motive or reasoning is behind it.
On that point, I was curious to get your perspective on this, Dennis, on the international volunteering situation. I think you wanted to speak up there before.
Yeah, thank you, Miloš. I mean, I've worked with international fighters, but I also had the pleasure of working with international volunteers who were there to first responders back in the States and came over to, provide, especially during the first kind of opening phases of the full scale invasion, to provide basic first aid training and kind of pass on best practices. And when you said you wanted something spicy, I immediately recounted a story where um, now this is somebody I can definitely call a friend of mine. It wasn't his first time here, but he had come over um, with one of his colleagues from the United States, and their whole ethos was to head out to the front and to provide medical first aid training to soldiers near the front lines, and if possible, even to get involved in evacuations of critically wounded individuals. And so this is somebody who was going in with um, that mindset, and being in Kyiv immediately before being meant to transfer out east, he had experienced for the first time in his life an air raid alert and a full scale Shahed and missile attack with, most being shot down, but as inevitably, some get through, and you can see these Star Wars up in the skies, especially during night, with the interceptors working, and that kind of changed their entire itinerary. And he said, "No, I don't think I want to go any more further east." And they were trying to explain to him, it's way different out there. It's not the same type of threat. We've got electronic jamming, and we've got nets, and we've got this and that, and here it's and that one experience just being hundreds of kilometers away from the front lines was enough to turn somebody who was headed to the front lines completely off of their intended path, and said, "No, this isn't for me." Um, so yeah, the security reality is for people on the ground, and I'm sure Kaitlyn will attest to this. Everyone makes their own calculations, and yes, you want to keep your team safe, but at the end of the day, this is just something that you factor into your daily decision making. And if it's just a Shahed drone, maybe you don't head to the air raid shelter. If it's Iskander supersonic ballistic missile, then maybe you want to reconsider. And I think this also goes to speak to the people on the ground who have to live with this day in and day out. That at a certain point, you're not going to let some Russian-launched Iranian drone mess with your day, even though you realize that there are certain risks associated with that decision. You have to keep on living, and at a certain point, it becomes a little bit trivial, which perhaps is not the wisest or safest decision, but I think it's kind of like a psychological buffer to normalize these things and to maintain some sense of normality, which for somebody who's experiencing it for the first time might be completely ununderstandable.
Yeah, just snowball on Dennis's little note there. It's I think people don't always you can't know how you will react. My first trip, I said I would go to Kyiv and see, and I thought maybe I'll last 3 days and then I'll need to leave. And 3 days later, I was actually on a train to the front line and meeting with the team and going into Kherson. And I don't know why. I can't always explain why I felt comfortable. I think it was because of the sense of strength and the team that I had around me and trust, the training that I'd already had to feel confident in some of these areas and understand the risk. But when I think back to 3 years ago, Kaitlyn going to Kherson, I had no idea the real risk. And then now living there, as Dennis has said, this has just become our normal. We have this psychological buffer. And for, I think, a lot of internationals coming in, you can't even imagine what you'll experience. You can't know until you're there. And your reaction is going to be very different and very varied. And as somebody in an organization, we respect and understand that, but we still have a goal. We still have work to do. And so these things can inhibit how we work. And that's okay. I tell people this all the time. You come, you be in Kiev for a little while, get acquainted, and you make that decision. We can't force you to stay. But how you deal with this is also important. And this circles to one of our pillars being PTSD trauma assistance, that also for all of our team, any volunteer that comes through Ukrainian Patriot, they have access to psychological support, counseling support, these kinds of things to work through being in a war zone, because nobody should be used to this, really.
Yeah, I think that's a very powerful point. So, just to round out the conversation on this past winter in Ukraine, Kaitlyn, how did UP respond to the crisis of the energy blackouts over the winter? And realistically, when it comes to your planning, are you guys already bracing and expecting to have to repeat those efforts next winter?
Yeah, absolutely. This winter was added challenges. I mean, already working in a country at war, and the day-to-day kind of normal challenges that we face, but the winter being um pivoting every day, every hour. Oh God, there's power. Get to the warehouse, get our shit together, kind of thing. We ran a couple of campaigns through the winter specifically for power sources, heat sources, things like this. A number of us that had birthdays through the winter did our own side fundraisers to drum up support and be able to purchase items that could make an impact immediately, um, which was helpful. It did slow our movements, and we had to make adjustments accordingly. And so, during that time, because those of us that are providing the aid and working towards the aid are also living through some of these challenges, that inhibited some of our work. We still got to the end point, but it took a little bit longer and a little bit more effort. And the fatigue from that, I think, was an experience that many of us had never experienced until March 1st, when winter was over and we could take a deep breath. Um, in my opinion, I fully expect the next winter to be the same. I think it's kind of always prepare for the worst, and see what happens. And in Ukraine, often you think it can't get worse, and then there's all these extra worse things, and they come up and down. So I know for us as an organization, we are grounding in by July, August, September, and making plans to ensure that we have a little bit more ease this upcoming winter than we did last winter. Perhaps the weather will be kinder to us. Perhaps our neighbor will decide to stop. But in the case that does not happen, we want to be as well prepared for those that we support, and our team's ability to do the support, to have the support.
Definitely. And you guys have both been very generous with your time tonight, and we're very grateful for that. So, as we get close to wrapping up here, are there any other UP aid efforts that you want to highlight right now that we have not discussed?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, we work off our pillars of operation. Unfortunately, as Dennis mentioned, the front line is vast. The humanitarian aid is ever changing, and the support for those things is lesser and lesser as we move into year 5. So, in supporting those things, it helps us continue supporting those real frontline communities. And then, in terms of supporting longevity and long term kind of project based items, such as our PTSD trauma assistance, helping us continue to run resilience sessions for kids in the front line, for women and civilians in the frontline communities, as well as supporting this summer. We've been working really hard on a property that we were able to purchase in the west of Ukraine that will house about 30 children at one time for a summer camp, and for rotating summer camps, removing them from their frontline circumstance for even just a week, and having this support, and this again being brought back to their childhood a little bit is very, very important. So sponsoring a child and making sure we can do those kind of sessions. Food bags, hygiene, the greatest need is very important, but keeping up the resilience that unfortunately, yes, Ukraine has kind of become famous for. But now I would say year 4 and 5, a little bit begrudgingly. Everyone's a little bit tired of having to be so resilient. And so supporting in that manner is greatly, greatly appreciated. And just my general note, as I always say to people, is that it's a very big puzzle and it is very complex and complicated and it's not black and white. But there are a number of ways to be a piece of that puzzle. Of course, supporting in terms of funds and donating, but as we also mentioned earlier, getting real, truthful information, seeking it out, saying that being very vocal about standing with Ukraine, talking to your representatives, talking to people in your circle, and keeping it on the forefront is a piece of the puzzle. And staying up to date, staying educated. There's a lots of different sides to this war. And so, with respect, we understand everybody can't be giving money and money all the time, but there's many other impactful ways that you can support Ukraine outside of just donating.
Awesome stuff. I think that's a great place to wrap this all up. So I wanted to take this moment to thank you both for joining us. It's been a real pleasure talking with the both of you, and it's been fantastic having you on. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much, guys, for having us.
For having us. And thank you for the work you do.
This has been an episode of the St. Martin's Cloak Podcast. Today is April 8th, 2026. Thank you for listening and stay safe.